He told his wife he never wanted to see her again. 3 years later, she came back with a child who had his eyes. New York City was humming that evening, wrapped in the usual chaos of taxi horns, blinking lights, and the constant rush of people chasing something: success, escape, or simply the next train. Inside a sleek, cold glass tower in Midtown, Alexander Miller stood by his office window, staring at the skyline that no longer inspired him. 35 years old, CEO of a major investment firm, a self-made millionaire with power and presence to match, Alex was the man other men envied. Dark brown hair, eyes like polished ice, an apartment in the clouds, and a reputation for being utterly untouchable. And yet, as he loosened his tie and checked his watch, the silence in his life was starting to scream. When he finally arrived home that night, later than usual, thanks to an emergency investor call, he noticed the difference before he even opened the door. The lights inside the penthouse were dimmed, but not in their usual cozy way. The air felt wrong, stiller than it should have. The hallway was too clean. Emma's shoes were gone. The scent of her perfume, always faint and floral, was missing from the air. He stepped inside and froze. Emma stood near the entrance with a suitcase beside her and her coat already on. She looked calm, almost practiced, like she had been rehearsing this moment in her mind for months. Her face wasn't angry, it was simply finished. That was the part that hit hardest. Not the suitcase. Not the coat. But that expression, the quiet kind of goodbye that doesn't need yelling to cut deep. He set down his keys and straightened his shoulders. "What is this?" "I'm leaving," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Tonight." He didn't move. "For how long?" "I don't know." He sighed, rubbing his temples as if she were one more problem to manage, one more detail in a life packed with them. "You're being dramatic, Emma. This isn't how we fix things." She gave a small, almost sad smile. "We don't fix anything, Alex. You work. You vanish. You talk to everyone but me. I've been alone in this marriage for years." He looked at her, jaw tight, tone clipped. "I gave you everything. This home, this life." "No," she interrupted. "You gave me a role. Something pretty for the public, someone who stood beside you at galas. You gave me silence. You gave me space. Too much of it." He turned away, trying to suppress the sting that crept beneath his skin. He hated this, the emotion, the rawness, the loss of control. "Then go," he muttered, voice low. "If you need to leave, leave. I don't care. I don't want to see you." Her eyes flickered, just for a second. Maybe with sadness. Maybe with something else. But she didn't cry. She didn't fight. She simply picked up the handle of her suitcase and walked to the elevator. She didn't tell him she was pregnant. She didn't say that she'd spent the last few weeks terrified, waiting for a reason to stay. He hadn't given her one. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Alex stood alone in the hallway, staring at the space where she had been. The silence settled in again, this time heavier, colder. He walked through the apartment, back to the kitchen, the living room, their bedroom. Everything was still there, furniture, artwork, clean countertops. But it was all hollow now, like a museum of a life someone had already left behind. He poured himself a drink, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared into the dark. He didn't call her. Didn't chase her. And he never once considered what she might have been carrying inside her when she walked away. 3 years passed like a blurred reel of meetings, mergers, flights, and boardrooms. Alexander Miller's life, from the outside, had only grown more impressive. His firm was now one of the most influential in the country. He had been featured on the cover of multiple financial magazines, and he was invited to speak at global economic summits. People called him relentless, sharp, unshakable. He had become exactly what he had always chased. But deep down, everything felt numb. Nights were silent. Mornings were mechanical. His home, though still pristine, felt like a model apartment, perfect on the surface but untouched by real life. He rarely thought about Emma. Or at least, he told himself that. Her name was a ghost he refused to say aloud. Whenever it surfaced in his mind, he buried it under numbers, emails, and obligations. What he never allowed himself to wonder about, ever, was whether she had moved on. Or if she had been hiding something that night she left. Regret was a luxury he refused to admit he had. It was a rainy evening in spring when the unexpected happened. Alex returned home from work early for once, something he almost never did. The elevator doors to the penthouse opened, and he stepped into the lobby area, scrolling through emails on his phone. He barely noticed the woman standing near the security desk until her voice, soft, unsure, cut through the quiet. "Alex?" He looked up, and his breath stalled. Emma was standing there, soaked from the rain, her blonde hair slightly longer now, her features thinner but still painfully familiar. She looked exactly like he remembered and yet completely different. Stronger. Wiser. And next to her stood a little girl. No more than 2 years old. The child held Emma's hand tightly, her blue eyes wide, curious, and incredibly familiar. She had dark brown hair, a little wild from the wind, and the same piercing gaze that Alex saw in the mirror every day. He stared at the girl, then at Emma, and back again. "What is this?" he asked slowly, his voice low and guarded. Emma crouched slightly to adjust the girl's jacket, then stood up straight and met his eyes. "This is Lily," she said. "She's your daughter." He blinked, almost laughed, but couldn't find any humor. "What kind of game is this?" "It's not a game," Emma said, her voice calm, firm. "I was pregnant when I left. I didn't tell you because, you didn't want to see me. You made that clear. And I wasn't going to beg for space in a life you'd already shut me out of." His chest tightened, but he kept his expression cold. "And now? Why come back now?" "Because she's asking questions," Emma said. "She wants to know who her father is. And as much as I've tried to explain, I can't be the only voice in her life. She deserves to know. Whether or not you want to be involved is your decision. But I won't lie to her. Not about you." Lily peeked out from behind Emma's leg and looked up at Alex, her small hand tightening around her mother's fingers. He felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't name, shock, guilt, recognition, fear. He cleared his throat, suddenly uncertain. "A test," he said. "DNA. I want proof." Emma didn't flinch. "Fine. Do whatever you need. I didn't come here to convince you. I came because she deserves truth. And if the man you are now can't handle that, we'll go." She turned, gently guiding the little girl back toward the elevator. Lily glanced back one last time, her blue eyes locked with his. And then they were gone. Alex stood frozen in the lobby, drenched in silence. His phone vibrated in his hand, but he ignored it. For the first time in years, the past had walked directly into his present, and it had a name, a face, and the eyes of a child he never knew he had. The test came back within a week, a simple envelope delivered by courier, resting on his glass kitchen counter like a bomb waiting to go off. Alex sat staring at it for over an hour, untouched, unopened, as if it had the power to undo everything that kept him composed. When he finally broke the seal and unfolded the document, the world narrowed into a single, inescapable truth: 99.98% probability of paternity. Lily was his daughter. His blood. His reflection. The first thing he felt wasn't joy. It was nausea. A kind of crushing awareness that while his company had grown, his portfolio expanded, and his reputation sharpened, he had missed the birth of his child, her first steps, her first words. He hadn't just failed to be a father. He had failed to be human. He didn't call Emma immediately. He needed time to absorb the weight of it, to understand what it meant beyond biology. But Emma, true to her word, reached out first. Her voice over the phone was calm, but not cold. She told him they were still in the city, staying temporarily in a rental apartment near Central Park. She said Lily had been asking questions about the tall man in the lobby. And then she said something that surprised him. She's curious, not angry. She doesn't know enough to be hurt yet. But she will, eventually, if we don't do something about this. Alex asked if he could see her. Not in a courtroom, not in a confrontation, just a meeting. Emma agreed, cautiously. A coffee shop on the Upper West Side. Neutral territory. Emma would sit at a nearby table, within earshot, but let them have space. The moment Lily walked in, wearing a little red coat with her dark hair curled at the ends, Alex forgot how to breathe. She looked even more like him than he remembered. The way she scanned the room, the way her fingers fidgeted with the zipper of her jacket, the way she didn't smile easily. He recognized himself in all of it. "Hi," he said when she stood in front of him. He was sitting to avoid towering over her. His voice was gentle, unsure. Lily tilted her head. "You're the man from the tall building," she said, not accusing, just stating a fact. "I am," he nodded. "My name's Alex." She looked at him curiously. "That's not a dad name." He laughed quietly. "Well, I've never been a dad before. I'm still learning." She didn't respond right away. She climbed onto the chair opposite him, her legs too short to touch the floor. She grabbed a paper straw and twisted it into a spiral while watching him from under her lashes. "Do you like frogs?" she asked suddenly. He blinked. "Frogs? Yes. I do. I have a frog book." "I've never really thought about frogs," he admitted, smiling. "But maybe you can teach me." She seemed to consider that for a moment, then gave a tiny nod. "Okay." They sat for 30 minutes. She talked more than he expected, about books, about her favorite cartoons, about a dream she had where her toothbrush came to life. He listened to every word like it was gold. Emma watched from a few tables away, not interfering, not smiling, just observing like someone too afraid to hope. When they stood to leave, Lily looked up at him and asked, "Are you going to come back?" "I want to," he said honestly. "Do you want me to?" She shrugged. "Maybe." He could work with that. He walked them to the corner, where Emma hailed a cab. As she buckled Lily into the seat, she looked over her shoulder at him. "She likes you," she said simply. "That's rare." He didn't reply. He just stood there, heart pounding, watching the cab pull away. For the first time in his life, Alexander Miller realized that no amount of money, power, or reputation would ever match the gravity of that one small word, maybe. It was all he had. But it was enough to start. The weeks that followed became a strange kind of in-between space for Alex. He was still running a company, still attending board meetings and handling billion-dollar decisions, but something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking only in profits and projections. He was thinking in crayons, picture books, nap times, and the sound of a little girl's voice telling him about frogs and clouds and how orange juice was better when it had just a little pulp. His calendar, once packed with corporate strategy sessions, now had blocks carved out with one word written in permanent ink, Lily. At first, the visits were short. A walk in the park, an hour in the children's section of the library, a hot chocolate shared at a bakery where Lily insisted on picking the table. Emma always stayed close but never hovered. She gave space, even when it was clear how carefully she was watching. She was protective, as she had every right to be, but she was also fair. She was letting Alex try. She was watching to see what kind of man he would choose to be this time. Lily was cautious. She didn't hug him. She didn't call him Dad. She didn't ask him personal questions. But she kept showing up. She allowed him into her world, little by little, like someone opening a window 1 inch at a time to see if the air outside could be trusted. Alex was patient. He didn't push. He read every parenting book he could get his hands on. He watched videos late at night on how to talk to kids without overwhelming them, how to listen without interrupting, how to be present without performing. He showed up early to every visit, waited without checking his phone, and always brought something small: stickers, coloring books, a toy frog once that Lily pretended not to like but carried in her backpack the next time they met. There were moments when it hurt more than he expected. One afternoon, as they sat on a bench near the lake and watched ducks paddle by, Lily turned to him and said, "Do you know how to braid hair?" When he said no, she nodded thoughtfully and replied, "Mommy does." She wasn't being mean. She wasn't comparing. But the truth in her voice cut deep. She had a history he hadn't been part of. A life that had moved on without him. She didn't say it, but it was written all over her face: she didn't need him. Not really. Not yet. Still, something kept growing. One rainy day, when Emma dropped Lily off at the museum, she handed Alex an extra umbrella and simply said, "We'll be a little late picking her up. Is that okay?" He nodded without hesitation. He didn't realize until hours later what that moment meant. She had trusted him, fully, for the first time, with their daughter. That afternoon, they wandered through the dinosaur exhibit, Lily holding his hand the entire time without noticing she was doing it. She asked questions about fossils, about meteors, about why the T-Rex had such small arms. He made up silly answers, and she laughed. At one point, she looked up at him and said, "You're different from the first time." He asked what she meant, and she shrugged, as kids do, and said, "You were more frozen." The word stayed with him for days. He wasn't frozen anymore. Something inside him was thawing, slowly, painfully, beautifully. And for the first time, he wasn't trying to go back and undo the past. He was just trying to be here, in the present, with a little girl who didn't owe him anything but who was beginning, cautiously, to let him in. One evening, after dropping Lily off, Emma lingered at the building's entrance instead of walking away. The night was quiet, and the city seemed far away, muted beneath the falling snow. "You're doing better than I expected," she said softly. Alex looked at her, not defensive, not triumphant, just honest. "I'm doing the best I can." She nodded, wrapping her coat tighter around herself. "She talks about you. A lot. More than she did before." "She still doesn't call me Dad," he said. "She will. When it feels right. It's not a title, Alex. It's a relationship. You're building it." He didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Only gratitude. Only the quiet, growing hope that maybe, just maybe, the girl who once didn't know his name might one day call him something more. Something that meant home. The shift came without warning, as shifts often do. It was a late afternoon in early summer when Emma called, her voice calm but unusually direct. She said she had been offered a new job in Boston, an opportunity too good to pass up. Higher pay, flexible hours, a leadership role in a firm she had admired for years. She wasn't calling to ask for permission. She was informing him, respectfully but firmly. The move would happen at the end of the month, and of course, she would be taking Lily. Alex stood in the middle of his office when he got the call, holding the phone to his ear while staring out the window, his reflection barely visible in the glass. The city sprawled beneath him, buzzing with opportunity and motion, and yet all of it felt like white noise. He had expected something like this eventually. Emma had always been ambitious, always looking for the next challenge, but the reality of it struck with more force than he could admit out loud. She was leaving. Again. And this time, she wasn't walking out alone. She was taking his daughter with her. "You're just going to leave?" he asked, trying to keep his voice level. "I'm not disappearing," she replied. "We'll call. We'll visit. You can come to Boston." But this job matters to me, and Lily deserves stability. Alex closed his eyes. I've just started to build something with her. You know that. You've seen it. I know, Emma said, and for the first time in the call, he heard emotion slip into her voice. That's why I told you now, so we could talk about it like adults. Like parents. I'm not trying to hurt you, Alex. But it will, he said. It already does. The silence that followed was long and heavy, full of things neither of them knew how to say. When they ended the call, it was with no resolution, only the understanding that something had to be done, and quickly. Alex called his lawyer the next day. He didn't want a fight. He didn't want courtrooms and affidavits and depositions. But he also couldn't just let Lily slip away. Not again. He had let that happen once, and it had cost him 3 years of her life. This time, he would not stand by. The paperwork was filed within a week. A formal petition for joint custody, with a specific objection to out-of-state relocation. Emma was shocked when she received it. Not because she didn't expect resistance, but because of how serious it was. The documents were precise, thorough, professional, but not aggressive. There were no personal attacks, no dramatic accusations. Just facts. And one line that stood out more than the rest, asterisk, the petitioner believes it is in the child's best interest to have continued, consistent access to both parents. Asterisk. The court date came quickly. Too quickly. They sat across from each other in the family courtroom, both dressed in muted tones, both with eyes that looked tired and hearts that seemed stretched thin. Lily stayed with a court-appointed specialist in a nearby room, coloring with markers and chatting about frogs and space rockets while her parents fought, quietly and politely, over who would get to watch her grow up. Alex's lawyer presented the case efficiently. He had become an active presence in Lily's life. He had proof of visits, photos, school events, even a video of them reading together at the library. He was no longer the absentee father who let her walk away 3 years ago. He had changed. He had earned the right to remain. Emma didn't deny any of it. She spoke with grace, explaining her reasons for the move, how much thought had gone into it, how she believed she was doing what was best for their daughter. She didn't attack Alex. In fact, at one point, she even said, "He's become a good father. I see that. And I'm proud of what he's doing." It wasn't enough to end the court process, but it shifted the mood. Then came the moment no one had fully prepared for. The judge wanted to hear from Lily. She was only 4, but old enough to understand simple questions. With both parents' consent, she was brought into the room with a specialist who guided the conversation gently. The courtroom waited as the child's words were relayed back through official notes. Her answers were innocent, yet weighted with unexpected clarity. "I like being with Mommy because she sings songs at night," Lily had said. "But I like being with Alex too. He listens when I talk. He doesn't rush." When asked where she wanted to live, she had paused and whispered, "Can I stay with both?" The courtroom fell silent. That one question undid the tension more effectively than any lawyer could. The judge leaned back, took a breath, and said something that stayed with Alex for a long time: "This child isn't a puzzle to be solved. She's a person to be supported. And you both need to grow into that." The final ruling allowed Emma to take the job, but only if Alex was granted an equal role. The judge proposed a shared custody arrangement with scheduled flights, extended visits, and required parental coordination. Alex would be part of school decisions, medical care, summer plans, and everything else that mattered. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was a bridge. After the hearing, Emma met him outside the courthouse. She looked tired, but something in her expression was softer than before. She asked if she could stay with both of us, Alex said quietly. Emma nodded. That's the only thing I cared about, really. That she felt safe enough to say it. They stood there for a moment, no longer as enemies, not quite as friends. Just two people bound together by something deeper than pain or paperwork, a little girl who had reminded them both of what mattered most. The first few months after the custody ruling felt like stepping onto a tightrope suspended between two cities, two lives, and one small heart in the middle. Coordinating schedules between New York and Boston wasn't easy. Flights were arranged, calendars shared, routines rewritten. It required patience, compromise, and constant communication, things that had once seemed impossible between Alex and Emma. But now, for Lily's sake, they both tried. And sometimes, to their quiet surprise, it worked. Alex rented a small apartment in Boston to avoid disrupting Lily's school life. It wasn't luxurious like his Manhattan penthouse, but it was warm and full of things that mattered, a bookshelf with her favorite stories, framed drawings she had made for him, and a hand-painted Lily's Corner sign she insisted on taping to her bedroom wall. He cooked her breakfast on weekends, learned how to braid her hair, badly at first, but with enough practice to earn her giggles, and even attended her preschool's "Dress Like Your Hero" day, showing up in a business suit with a silly homemade cape just because she asked. Every week, he made sure their time together felt like something stable, not borrowed. It wasn't about spoiling her or making up for lost years anymore. It was about consistency. Presence. Showing up for the bedtime stories and the scraped knees and the tears when her toy frog got lost in a grocery store. These things, he learned, mattered far more than anything money could buy. There were challenges too. Sometimes Lily would cry when it was time to leave one parent for the other. Sometimes she would act out, overwhelmed by transitions. She once asked him why grown-ups made things so complicated, and Alex had no good answer. He just pulled her close and promised he was learning. And he meant it. His relationship with Emma began to shift as well. They started to find rhythm in the way they co-parented. Conversations that had once been clipped and defensive now held moments of softness, even humor. They began to share stories about Lily's quirks, laugh over her stubbornness, worry together when she had a fever. And every so often, during these shared moments, something unspoken would pass between them, a flicker of what used to be, mixed with the unfamiliar ease of who they were becoming. One quiet evening in December, after Lily had fallen asleep in his apartment, Emma stopped by to pick up a school project Lily had left behind. It was late, and snow had just started to fall, soft flakes piling on the windowsill. She stepped inside and paused in the doorway of Lily's room, watching her sleep. Alex stood beside her, silent, unsure if he should say anything. "She looks so much like you when she's thinking," Emma whispered. "But she laughs like I did at her age." Alex nodded. "She's better than both of us." Emma smiled faintly, still looking at their daughter. "Maybe because she has both of us now." They didn't speak for a moment, wrapped in a shared silence that felt gentle instead of heavy. Then she turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "I found something the other day," she said. "When we were moving. A letter. One you wrote, years ago. You never sent it." His stomach turned. He remembered the letter. A clumsy, too-late attempt at apology, written the night she left but never delivered. "I read it," she added. "I'm glad I didn't read it back then. I wouldn't have believed a word of it. But now." She trailed off, then looked up at him. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't nostalgic either. It was something gentler, harder to name. "Now I think maybe you meant it." "I did," he said quietly. She nodded again, then walked out, leaving behind the faint scent of winter air and something that felt almost like peace. That night, after closing the door and checking on Lily once more, Alex stood alone in the quiet of his apartment. He thought about the time he had lost. The version of himself that let people walk away. The man who had once said, "I don't want to see you," to the only person who ever truly saw him. And now here he was, standing on the other side of that moment, changed not by success or redemption, but by a little girl with dark brown hair and sky-blue eyes who had taught him how to show up, how to stay, how to be still, and how to begin again. Spring came slowly to Boston, brushing away the last clinging signs of winter with soft winds and trees that began to bloom in pale pinks and early green. Lily's world, now divided between two cities, had begun to feel whole in ways no one had expected. She moved between homes like someone who had always known how to navigate two sets of rhythms. And for the first time, Alex didn't feel like a visitor in her life. He felt like a father. He had started rearranging his work around her schedule. Business trips were booked only on weeks she was with Emma. Late meetings were held remotely or rescheduled altogether. His priorities had shifted so completely that even his closest colleagues noticed, though no one dared question it. They simply watched as the man who once measured time only in deadlines now measured it in bedtime stories, finger paintings, and, "Dad, can I show you something?" moments. The apartment he'd rented in Boston began to transform. It no longer felt temporary. Lily had filled it with her presence, a tiny keyboard in the corner, shelves lined with books and stuffed animals, glittery art taped to the refrigerator. On weekends, they made pancakes, always too thick, always a little burnt, but always eaten with sticky fingers and laughter. She liked to sit on the kitchen counter while he cooked, swinging her legs and offering unsolicited advice. "Don't forget the vanilla this time," she'd say, watching him like a tiny supervisor. "Last time it tasted like nothing." Emma, too, seemed more at ease. She and Alex had begun speaking more freely, exchanging updates without tension, even sharing the occasional joke when they dropped Lily off. One evening, after a parent-teacher conference, they ended up walking the long way home, side by side, their hands occasionally brushing. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't talk about what they were. But something had changed, there was warmth between them again, not forced, not nostalgic, just real. Then one afternoon, Lily brought it all to the surface without even realizing it. They were sitting on a park bench, the kind with chipped green paint and initials carved into the wood. She was eating a popsicle, bright red juice dripping down her hand, and staring out at the playground. Without turning, she asked, "Do you think maybe one day we could all live in the same house?" Alex felt the breath leave his lungs. He glanced at her, unsure how to answer. "What makes you ask that?" She shrugged. "It'd be easier. Less bags to pack. And I think Mommy smiles more now when you're around." He looked down at her and smiled softly. "That's a big decision. Not just about packing bags." "I know," she said simply. "I just think, maybe it would be nice." He didn't promise anything. He didn't need to. The fact that she had said it at all, that she even imagined it, meant something had healed. Or was healing. That evening, he walked Emma back to her building after dropping Lily off. They stood at the door a moment longer than usual. Neither of them spoke. Then, very quietly, Alex said, "She asked me if we'd ever live in the same house." Emma didn't look surprised. "She asked me the same thing last week." He laughed softly, the sound wrapped in something tender. "And what did you say?" "I told her I didn't know," Emma said. "But I liked that she wanted it." There was a long pause. Their eyes met, and for the first time since that night years ago when she had walked out of his life, the space between them didn't feel like a void. It felt like a bridge. Neither made a grand declaration. There were no sweeping gestures or promises made under moonlight. But when Emma leaned in and kissed him softly on the cheek before going inside, it wasn't hesitant. It wasn't confused. It was a beginning. Alex stood on the sidewalk for a long time afterward, watching the light in Lily's window flicker on. He thought of all the ways life could change, not through force, not through plans, but through small moments like that one. A child's wish. A quiet kiss. A shared walk through the city. It was no longer about fixing what was broken. It was about building what came next. Together. Gently. Honestly. The morning of Lily's 6th birthday arrived with the kind of sunshine that made everything feel golden. The apartment smelled of vanilla and fresh strawberries, the remnants of the homemade cake Alex had stayed up late decorating the night before. There were balloons taped to the walls, a hand-drawn banner with crooked letters hanging across the living room window, and a stack of wrapped gifts on the kitchen table. But the brightest part of it all was Lily herself, wearing a sparkly silver dress, her hair curled at the ends just the way she liked it, and a grin wide enough to light up the entire block. They had decided, all three of them, to host the party at the local community garden where Lily liked to chase butterflies in the summer. It was simple, colorful, open, and full of the things that made her happiest: flowers, open sky, and friends. Emma arrived early to help set up, and when Alex saw her step out of the car carrying 2 trays of cupcakes and a basket of party favors, he couldn't help but smile. She wore a soft blue sundress, her hair tied back, her eyes bright. There was no tension between them now. There hadn't been for a long time. They moved around each other easily, naturally, finishing each other's thoughts, laughing when Lily made up her own rules for the party games, and sharing glances that spoke of things both old and quietly new. The guests began to arrive: classmates, neighbors, a few cousins who'd flown in with their parents. The air filled with chatter and music, the scent of lemonade and frosting, and the sounds of children shouting over who got the last piece of watermelon. Alex watched it all, amazed by how full his life had become. There was a time, not long ago, when he wouldn't have been able to handle this much chaos, this much emotion. But now, he felt steady. Present. Grateful. At the center of it all was Lily, spinning in circles with her friends, her laughter bubbling up like a song. She moved freely between Alex and Emma, grabbing one hand, then the other, making them dance, making them sit beside her during cake, making them both part of her world with no hesitation. To her, this was normal. 2 parents, 1 family. No tension. No cracks. Just love, rebuilt with time and intention. As the party wound down, the sun casting long golden shadows across the garden, the children gathered for one last moment. Lily's teacher, who had kindly offered to help coordinate the activities, announced that Lily wanted to say something. The kids quieted, the parents gathered around, and Lily stood on a wooden crate with a plastic crown tilted on her head. She looked out at everyone, her blue eyes shining, and said, "Thank you for coming to my party. It's the best birthday ever. But I want to say something for my mommy and my daddy." The crowd went still. Alex and Emma exchanged a quick look, unsure of what was coming. Lily held up a small piece of paper she had folded and unfolded a dozen times that day. "I wrote a wish," she said. "And I want to say it now." She cleared her throat, her voice careful but strong. "My wish is that we always stay together. Not just on birthdays. But every day. Because when we're all together, it feels like the sun is always out, even when it rains." There was a moment of silence before the applause began, soft at first, then warm and full. Emma wiped at the corner of her eye. Alex blinked more than he needed to. After the guests had gone, after the folding chairs were packed and the last cupcake was wrapped in foil, they stood in the quiet together, just the 3 of them. Lily leaned against Alex's leg, sleepy but content, and Emma stood close beside him, her hand brushing his. "She's something," Emma whispered. "She's everything," Alex said. Emma looked up at him, her face thoughtful. "You know, we could start small. Not rush. But maybe, see where this goes." Alex didn't speak for a moment. He looked at her, then at Lily, then back again. He reached out and took Emma's hand fully this time, not just a brush or a moment. "A choice. I already know where it goes," he said quietly. "Home." As they walked back toward the car, Lily between them holding both their hands, the sky above them slowly shifted from gold to lavender. The evening was calm, but alive. Not perfect, but real. A family, remade. Not from what they used to be, but from who they had become. Stronger. Braver. Together. He walked into his restaurant expecting a quiet lunch, but everything changed the moment he saw three little girls being forced out of the place he thought he controlled. Henry Winslow walked into his flagship restaurant with the same confident precision that defined every part of his life. He wasn't just the CEO of a luxury dining empire, he was its architect, its heartbeat, and its untouchable face. With his sharp navy suit, crisp white shirt, and a gold watch peeking from beneath his cuff, he looked exactly like the kind of man who never made time for accidents. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his blue eyes alert but cool, and every movement seemed measured, purposeful. He had come in for a routine lunch before an investor meeting across town, expecting nothing more than his usual quiet corner table, a seared salmon with lemon risotto, and 15 uninterrupted minutes of control. The restaurant staff moved quickly when he entered, offering polite nods and subtle signs of recognition. No one spoke unless spoken to, just how Henry liked it. The manager guided him to his usual seat by the window, where the view overlooked the city's bustling street. He pulled out his phone to scan emails as the waiter approached, but then something distracted him. There was a shift in tone across the dining room, low voices, tense whispers, a sudden awkward silence that made him look up from his screen. At first, he didn't think much of it. But then he saw a commotion at the far end of the restaurant, near the less formal seating area by the glass doors. Three small girls, seated at a table that had clearly not been assigned to them, were surrounded by a hostess and a nervous-looking waitress. The staff were not being cruel, but they were firm. The girls looked out of place in a setting like this, wearing mismatched pink jackets and white cotton dresses, their blonde braids slightly undone, their shoes scuffed and damp from the street. They hadn't ordered anything. One of them clutched a dollar bill in her small hand, the other held an apple, and the third simply stared down at her empty place setting with wide, solemn eyes. The manager was approaching them now, likely to ask them to leave. Henry narrowed his eyes. Something about the way the smallest girl gripped her sister's arm made him stand up before he realized he was moving. He crossed the restaurant slowly, aware of the sudden quiet behind him, aware that the entire staff was watching. As he approached the table, the girls looked up. They were identical in face, triplets, it seemed, and each had the same piercing blue eyes. But there was something in those eyes that froze him. Not fear. Not mischief. Something else. Recognition. He wasn't sure. Before anyone could speak, one of the girls said softly, "Our mom told us to come here. She said our dad is the man who owns this place." The room went still. Henry stared at her, heart thudding once in his chest like a warning bell. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The staff looked to him for a signal. The girls looked to him for an answer. And for the first time in years, Henry Winslow had no idea what to say. The silence that followed the girls' words lingered heavier than any he'd ever experienced in a boardroom. Henry stood still, staring at the three little girls in front of him, their identical faces filled with something that didn't fit in this gleaming, high-end restaurant, something raw, unfiltered, and real. He could feel the eyes of his staff and several patrons glued to the scene, but none of that mattered. All that existed in that moment was the small, determined voice of the child who had just claimed to be his daughter. His mind raced for logic, but instead, memory flooded in, one he hadn't allowed himself to think about in years. Clara. The name hit him like a wave. 7 years ago, she had vanished from his life without explanation. One day she had been there, laughing in his kitchen, whispering plans about the future, and the next she was gone. She had never returned his calls. Never responded to his letters. At first, he had been angry, then devastated, and eventually, he buried her in the part of his heart he didn't allow anyone to touch. He hadn't known she was pregnant. He hadn't even known she had left the city. And now, right in front of him, were three undeniable reflections of her, blonde like she was, their eyes almost identical to his own. He took a slow breath and crouched down to their level, careful not to frighten them. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "I'm Sophie," the one with the dollar said. The second girl, the one with the apple, said, "I'm Grace." The third, quieter, murmured, "I'm Layla." Henry nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "And your mom, her name was Clara?" All three nodded. Sophie added, "She got really sick. We don't live far. But when she got worse, she told us to come here. She said, if anything happens, find the man who runs that restaurant. He's your dad." Her voice cracked at the end, and Henry felt something collapse inside him. He stood and looked at the staff, who were now frozen in place, unsure of what to do. "It's fine," he said quietly. "They're staying." He motioned to the table beside his usual spot. "Get them something warm. Whatever they want. And tell the kitchen to take care of it personally." No one questioned him. The girls moved to the new table, hesitating slightly until he reached out and gently placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. It was enough. They sat, still holding their small treasures, $1, one apple, as if letting go of them might make everything too real. As they began to eat, Henry sat across from them, watching each small movement with disbelief and growing awe. He asked gentle questions, careful not to overwhelm them. They told him about Clara's illness, about the neighbor who was watching them while she was in the hospital. They didn't know she had fallen into a coma. They thought she was resting. When they said it, his breath caught in his throat. He realized these girls had come here out of love and trust, not desperation. They believed in the story their mother told them, believed enough to find a stranger in a suit and call him their father. He tried to imagine how Clara must have felt, knowing her time was running out, choosing to send her daughters to the one person she thought might protect them. It broke him to think of her facing that decision alone. And it broke him more to realize that in all his years of building empires, negotiating billion-dollar deals, and conquering headlines, he had missed the most important moment of his life, the moment he became a father. By the time dessert arrived, the girls were laughing softly, their hands sticky with melted chocolate, their eyes brighter. They trusted him with the ease only children could give. And for the first time since Clara disappeared, Henry felt something real click back into place inside him, not guilt, not regret, but responsibility. A pull stronger than ambition, deeper than fear. He didn't know what came next, but he knew this, he wasn't going to walk away again. Henry didn't return to the office that day. His assistant called twice, and he ignored both. Instead, he rode with the girls in the back of a town car, their tiny voices filling the air with hesitant questions and whispers. They gave him directions back to the apartment where they were temporarily staying with a woman named Mrs. Elkins, a retired nurse who had lived next door to Clara for years. When they arrived, Mrs. Elkins opened the door with a worried look on her face that softened the moment she saw the girls safe and smiling. But her eyes shifted quickly to Henry, widening with recognition and a sharp trace of disbelief. "You're him," she said, not as a question but a quiet revelation. "You're Henry." He nodded, offering a quiet hello. She didn't scold him. She didn't need to. There was something in her expression, equal parts sorrow and exhausted relief, that said enough. She invited him in and handed him a box almost immediately. It was worn around the edges, with Clara's name scrawled across the top in her familiar handwriting. "She asked me to give you this if something ever happened," Mrs. Elkins said, and then stepped into the kitchen to give them space. Henry sat down on the worn couch, the girls curled beside him, and lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, old notes, drawings in crayon labeled "Mommy and Me," and a sealed envelope with his name on it. His breath caught as he opened it. Clara's handwriting poured across the page, uneven and faded in places, as if she had written it in pain. She explained how she had found out she was pregnant after they separated, how she had tried to contact him but never received a response, how she eventually gave up and chose to raise the girls alone. She told him how proud she was of them, how much they looked like him when they smiled. She wrote that if he was reading the letter, it meant she hadn't made it through. And she asked, no, begged, that he take care of them if he could, that he at least try. Henry closed his eyes and gripped the letter tightly, his throat aching. He had built a world where control and order shielded him from the unknown, from mess, from emotion. But none of that mattered now. What mattered were the 3 children beside him, looking up at him not as a CEO, not as a stranger, but as the man their mother had trusted above anyone else. He looked down at them and said, with quiet certainty, "I'm not going anywhere." The next hours moved quickly. He contacted his lawyer to begin emergency guardianship paperwork. He spoke with Mrs. Elkins about keeping the girls comfortable until arrangements could be made. He arranged for a pediatrician to visit. And later, after the girls had fallen asleep under a blanket on the couch, he sat in silence, the open box still on his lap, the weight of it pressing deep into his chest. For the first time in years, his mind didn't race with numbers or deadlines. It stayed focused on a single truth: these girls were his. Not just biologically, not just legally, but wholly and completely. He had missed their first steps, their first words, the early birthdays and scraped knees, but he wouldn't miss another moment if he could help it. Clara had given him a gift wrapped in heartbreak, and he would honor it the only way he knew how, by showing up, fully, every single day. When he finally left the apartment that night, he didn't return to his penthouse. Instead, he checked into a hotel near the girls, unwilling to be far. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the day in his mind, feeling every beat of it settle deeper into his soul. Something inside him had changed. Irrevocably. And he didn't want to undo it. Not now. Not ever. The following morning arrived before Henry had closed his eyes. Sleep had been elusive, not because of discomfort, but because his mind couldn't settle. Every image from the day before looped in his thoughts: the girl's small hands, the letter from Clara, the sound of Sophie's voice when she said, "She told us you were our dad." He had known pressure before, he had made decisions that shifted markets, but this was different. This was something far more intimate, something that demanded not sharpness or power, but softness, presence, and heart. By sunrise, he was already showered and dressed, not in a suit but in jeans and a sweater that hadn't left his closet in years. He needed to be someone else now, or maybe he just needed to be more of who he once was, long before all the layers of success covered everything that mattered. He stopped at a small bakery on the way to the apartment and bought warm croissants, fresh orange juice, and a bag of chocolate chip cookies after remembering Grace had said they were her favorite. The air was cold but light, and the streets were still quiet when he reached the familiar door. Mrs. Elkins opened it with a soft smile and nodded without words, stepping aside as if he belonged there already. The girls were still asleep on the couch, curled in different directions under the same quilt, one foot sticking out, one hand clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. He sat in the kitchen with Mrs. Elkins, who poured him coffee and said softly, "They've been through more than they show." Henry nodded, knowing words weren't enough to answer her truth. When the girls finally woke, it was Layla who noticed him first. She sat up slowly, rubbed her eyes, and gave him a sleepy grin. "You're still here," she whispered, as if she had dreamed him and wasn't sure it was real. "I told you I would be," he replied gently. One by one, they shuffled into the kitchen, where the smell of croissants and the sight of real juice made their eyes widen. It was a simple breakfast, but it felt like a feast. They ate in near silence, but it wasn't awkward, it was comfort. It was warmth. And it was new. After breakfast, Henry asked if he could take them to the park. The idea lit up their faces in a way that tightened his throat. He called his driver to bring a car, but when the girls said they liked walking better, he cancelled it and they walked, hand in hand, 3 small sets of fingers tangled in his. At the park, they ran across the frost-covered grass, climbed the jungle gym, and asked him to push them on the swings. He did, laughing for the first time in what felt like years. He pushed them higher and higher, and they screamed with joy, shouting, "Higher, Dad," until the word pierced him like sunlight. None of them noticed the people passing by or the looks from strangers. For a moment, they were just a man and 3 little girls who belonged to him in a way deeper than words. Later, they sat on a bench with cheeks flushed from cold air and smiles that hadn't left their faces. Layla asked if he had a house. He said yes. Grace asked if there were rooms for all of them. He said there could be. Sophie was quiet until she said, "Can we go there someday?" He didn't hesitate. "You'll go there soon," he said, voice steady. "As soon as we make sure everything is safe and right." They nodded like they understood more than children should have to. That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Henry sat again in the living room with Mrs. Elkins and asked about Clara. The older woman shared pieces of the story he hadn't heard, the slow decline in Clara's health, the strength she carried in silence, her refusal to let the girls see how much pain she was in. She had worked from home as long as she could, had sold her jewelry to pay rent, had walked the girls to school even when she was too weak. "She never said a word against you," Mrs. Elkins added softly. "She just wanted them to have a chance to know who you were." Henry stared at the floor, guilt thick in his chest, but also something else, resolve. He couldn't change the past, couldn't fix what had been lost, but he could write what came next. And that, he realized, was everything. Before he left that night, he kissed each girl's forehead as they slept and whispered promises he meant to keep. He would return tomorrow. And the next day. And the day after that. Because he wasn't just their father by name. He was ready to become it in every sense. Henry began rearranging his life one quiet decision at a time. He didn't make grand announcements or dramatic exits from the business world. Instead, he shifted meetings to the early morning so he could spend afternoons with the girls. He handed off more responsibility to his executive team, who looked surprised but relieved, and he started showing up late on purpose just so he wouldn't have to rush out of breakfast with them. He had spent so many years building his image around control and authority that he had forgotten what it felt like to be needed without performance. Now, he was discovering a different kind of purpose, one that came with sticky fingers, sudden questions about animals, and the sharp ache of knowing how much time he had already lost. The girls had begun to let him in without hesitation, though he still saw the hesitation in himself. Sophie was the leader of the three, cautious but fiercely protective. She often watched him with her mother's eyes, evaluating his promises before she believed them. Grace was quieter, more thoughtful, prone to long silences that ended in brilliant, unexpected insights. Layla was all emotion, quick to laugh, quick to cry, and always the first to reach for his hand. They had memorized his rhythm within days, adapting with a grace he didn't understand but deeply admired. On Wednesday, he picked them up from school for the first time. They ran toward him without fear, their backpacks bouncing, their smiles wide. Other parents watched curiously, perhaps recognizing him from news headlines or wondering how someone in a cashmere coat fit into the schoolyard. But the girls didn't care, and neither did he. In that moment, as they grabbed his hands and told him about art class and snack time and a classmate named Ava who had a hamster named Waffles, he realized he had never felt more real. Back at the apartment, they pulled him into their world completely. He learned the names of their stuffed animals. He built a blanket fort in the living room that they declared a secret spy cave. He read 3 chapters of a book he had never heard of, using silly voices that made them collapse into laughter. And when it was time for bed, they asked him to stay. He tucked them in, turned off the light, then sat outside the door for nearly an hour just to be sure they slept soundly. Later that night, he called Clara's doctor. The hospital had sent her medical records at his request, and he wanted to understand everything. The conversation was clinical, respectful, but it shook him. She had known for months. She had fought for every extra week. She had declined aggressive treatment not because she gave up, but because she wanted to be clear-headed and present for her girls. She had written letters to them. She had left notes inside books. She had stitched herself into their lives so they would never forget her. And then, quietly, she had sent them to him, her last leap of faith. Henry didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window and stared out at the city lights, thinking about what it meant to be chosen like that. Clara hadn't asked for help until the end, and even then, she hadn't demanded anything. She had simply trusted him to do the right thing, to show up, to love them. He thought about the years he had spent avoiding vulnerability, choosing detachment over risk, ambition over connection. None of it meant anything now if he failed these girls. So, he made a decision. He would not just provide. He would not just visit and supervise and schedule. He would become their home. He would move them out of the temporary space, into somewhere filled with light and warmth and safety. He would give them consistency, patience, love. And he would do it not because of guilt or obligation, but because he wanted to. Because when Grace whispered, "Good night, Daddy," for the first time, he didn't want to cry. He wanted to earn it. Every single day. The move happened on a Sunday morning, quiet and unceremonious, but full of emotion beneath the surface. Henry had spent the previous week preparing everything with meticulous care, not the kind of careful planning he used for business mergers or investor meetings, but something far more personal. He had hired decorators, but only after asking each of the girls what color they wanted in their rooms, what kind of bed they preferred, what books they loved most. He took their drawings and framed them. He stocked the kitchen with their favorite cereals, the kind with too much sugar, and even labeled the shelves with their names. It wasn't perfect. It didn't feel like a home yet. But it felt ready to become one. When the girls arrived at the new apartment, a spacious corner unit filled with soft morning light, they stood in the entryway silently, unsure of whether they were allowed to be excited. Henry didn't say anything at first. He just set down their bags, knelt in front of them, and said, "This is yours now. Every part of it. Your home." That was when Layla ran into the living room and shouted, "I call the window seat." Sophie opened every door with purpose, checking each room before nodding in quiet approval. Grace walked slowly, her fingers brushing against the walls, as if trying to memorize the space. They found their rooms, their books, their beds. Then they found him again and didn't let go for a long time. The next few days were a blur of settling in, school drop-offs, unpacking boxes, learning how to braid hair without tangling it, arguing over pajamas, and discovering that the dishwasher made a strange beeping sound every 20 minutes. Henry learned to wake up earlier than usual so he could sit with them at breakfast. He started writing little notes and hiding them in their lunchboxes, even though he felt foolish at first. The girls would return in the afternoon waving the notes like they were golden tickets. They had inside jokes now, silly songs for brushing teeth, a rule that Friday nights were for popcorn and movies on the floor. Slowly, the space between them disappeared. But underneath the laughter and newness, there were still moments of silence that stretched too long. Once, Henry found Grace staring at a photo of Clara in her room. She didn't cry. She just held the frame in her lap and said, "Sometimes I forget what her voice sounded like." Henry sat beside her and said, "Then we'll remember it together." He played the one voicemail Clara had left him, the one he had saved years ago without knowing why. It was her saying something ordinary, something about forgetting a book at his place. But her voice was there. And for Grace, that was everything. Sophie, ever the quiet one, had trouble sleeping in the new place. Henry noticed her wandering the hallway at night, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He didn't ask questions. He just made space for her on the couch and let her fall asleep beside him, sometimes with his arm around her, sometimes with just silence. Layla, on the other hand, began calling him Dad more consistently now, not in big moments, but in passing, "Dad, can I have more juice?" or "Dad, I forgot my math folder." Each time, it hit him with unexpected force. He would nod, answer normally, then later step into his room and sit on the edge of the bed, stunned by the quiet miracle of it. It wasn't all easy. There were tantrums, forgotten homework, missed calls from work, and days when Henry felt completely unequipped. There were times when he doubted himself, when the weight of what he'd missed nearly crushed him. But then there were moments like watching the girls dance in the living room in socks and pajamas, or hearing them shout his name when he walked in the door, or seeing Grace draw a picture of their new home with all four of them in it, labeled "Us." Those moments rewrote everything he thought he knew about what mattered. One evening, as he tucked them in, Sophie asked, are you going to stay forever? Henry looked at her, at all three of them, and said, I'll stay for every single forever you need. He kissed each of them goodnight, turned off the light and stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to, listening to the soft breaths of the daughters he had almost lost and now couldn't imagine life without. Spring crept in without ceremony, transforming the city streets with soft sunlight and the faint blush of blossoms on the trees. For Henry, the season brought with it a sense of calm he hadn't realized he was craving. Life had become beautifully ordinary. Gone were the sterile evenings filled with silence and emails. Now, his days began with the hum of morning cartoons, the chaos of packing school lunches, and tiny feet running across hardwood floors. The girls had settled into a rhythm that felt like they had always lived there. Their laughter filled the apartment in unexpected waves, turning it from a place to sleep into a place that felt alive. Each of the girls had found their own way of growing within this new life. Sophie took to organizing things, books, shoes, even breakfast cereal. She liked to feel in control, and Henry understood that came from wanting to hold together a world that once felt like it was falling apart. Grace began writing poems, quietly scribbling them in notebooks and leaving them in different corners of the house for someone to find. Her words were simple, soft, and honest in a way that broke Henry's heart and mended it at the same time. Layla never stopped asking questions, about the moon, about how coffee worked, about whether penguins could be kept as pets. Henry answered every single one, even when he didn't know the answers, because what mattered most was that she trusted him enough to ask. They started a new tradition every Sunday, brunch followed by a walk to the bookstore, where each girl got to pick one thing, even if it wasn't a book. One morning, as they stood in line to pay, the cashier looked at Henry and the girls and smiled, saying, "You've got your hands full." Without thinking, Henry replied, "Yeah, full of everything I never knew I needed." The girls didn't notice the weight of that sentence, but he did. He felt it linger inside him as they walked home hand in hand. That week, Sophie had a school project about families. Each student had to present a photo of their home life and explain who they lived with. Henry offered to take a new picture, and they posed in the kitchen, flour on their cheeks from a failed batch of pancakes, smiles too wide to be forced. When Sophie stood at the front of the classroom to present, she pointed at the photo and said, "This is me, my sisters, and my dad." He didn't know we were his at first. But he came anyway. And he stayed. That's what makes a real family. Henry, standing in the back with the other parents, had to turn his head and wipe his eyes before anyone noticed. Later that evening, while folding laundry, Grace came in holding one of her poems. She didn't say anything, just placed it beside him and left the room. He picked it up and read it slowly. The poem was titled Promise, and it ended with the line, "He didn't say forever." But he meant it anyway. Henry closed his eyes and held the page to his chest. He wasn't a man of poetry, not before, but that one line felt more honest than any contract he had ever signed. As the girls got ready for bed that night, Henry watched them dance around their rooms in mismatched pajamas, brushing teeth to silly songs, and giggling about something only they understood. The apartment buzzed with a quiet magic that had nothing to do with design or luxury. It came from the presence of something Henry had lived most of his life without, unconditional love. Love that didn't need to be earned or explained or justified. It was simply there, wrapped in tiny arms and late-night stories and the steady trust of three girls who believed in him more than he had ever believed in himself. After they were asleep, Henry stood alone in the hallway, looking down the line of open doors, each one softly lit from within. He thought about Clara, about how she had raised them alone, how much courage it must have taken to send them to him with nothing more than a note and a prayer. He whispered into the quiet, "Thank you," not knowing if she could hear it, but needing to say it anyway. Because even in her absence, she had given him the one thing he never thought he could have, a family. And he was going to protect it with everything he had left. The 1-year mark arrived quietly, without fanfare or announcement, just the way Clara would have wanted it. Henry had planned nothing elaborate, though he had thought about it for weeks, unsure whether to let the day pass like any other or to acknowledge it in some meaningful way. In the end, he chose something simple. He told the girls they were taking the day off from school and work, and they would spend it together, outside, away from routines and obligations. He didn't call it an anniversary or try to explain its weight to them. He just said, let's go somewhere she would have loved, and they understood without needing more. They drove to a quiet meadow outside the city where wildflowers had just begun to bloom. The air was clean and cool, filled with the kind of stillness that felt sacred. Henry had packed a picnic, the girls' favorite sandwiches, a chocolate cake, and a thermos of tea, and they laid everything out on a blanket beneath a wide tree. Grace brought along a small framed photo of Clara and placed it gently in the center, like a guest of honor. Sophie held a folded letter she had written and didn't speak for a long time, just kept glancing down at it as if waiting for the right moment. Layla carried a bouquet of wildflowers, clutched tightly in her small hands. After they ate, Henry invited them to share stories, and the girls each took a turn. Grace remembered how Clara used to hum a lullaby that had no words but always made her feel safe. Layla talked about how Clara would let them wear her scarves and call it a fashion show, even on days she was too tired to stand. Sophie finally read her letter aloud, voice shaking but strong. In it, she thanked Clara for everything, for loving them, for being brave, and for finding a way to make sure they wouldn't be alone. When she finished, Henry couldn't speak. He just reached for her hand and held it tightly. One by one, they released little pieces of paper into the wind, memories, hopes, promises, all written in crayon and pencil and folded carefully. Henry added one of his own, though he didn't read it aloud. It simply said, "I won't waste a single day you gave me." The papers lifted into the air, caught by the breeze, and floated upward until they disappeared completely. For a long moment, they sat in silence, watching the sky as if waiting for an answer that didn't need to come. There were no tears, just a quiet peace that settled in all four of them. Back at home that evening, the apartment felt the same but somehow different. There was a softness in the way the girls moved through the space, as if something invisible had shifted and made room for something new. Henry stood in the kitchen making tea while the girls curled up on the couch with a blanket and a movie. They didn't ask for toys or screen time or snacks. They just wanted to be close. He brought them warm mugs of cocoa and sat between them as they leaned into his sides, all three tucked against him as if that space had been made for them from the very beginning. As the movie ended, Layla whispered, "She'd be happy, right?" Henry looked at her, at the faces of all three girls glowing in the soft light, and answered without hesitation, "She'd be proud. Of you. Of us. Of how far we've come." Sophie rested her head on his shoulder and Grace placed her hand on top of his, fingers small but steady. In that moment, there was no room for doubt. No room for guilt or fear. Only belonging. Later, after the girls had gone to bed, Henry stood alone on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. The skyline had once been a symbol of everything he had built, his power, his status, his control. Now, it was just a backdrop to what mattered most inside those four walls behind him. He thought about all the versions of himself he had once been, the driven executive, the detached man, the one who had thought he could outrun pain with success. He didn't want to be any of those men anymore. He just wanted to be their father. That was enough. He stepped back inside, locked the door behind him, and turned off the lights. In the darkness, he moved quietly through the apartment, pausing at each of their rooms, listening to the soft breathing, watching the slow rise and fall of blankets. Then he whispered, not to anyone in particular but to the air itself, "I kept my promise." And with that, he let the quiet wrap around him, not like a weight, but like a home.